We have a lot to cover on these topics, so I'm going to go ahead and get us started. Okay, so as a quick introduction, my name is Jacob Chapman. I'm the Director of Industrial IT and Cybersecurity here at Grantek. I'm responsible for Grantek strategy in that space. So as a part of my job, I stay very involved in industry groups. I chair the cybersecurity committee in the ISA's Smart Manufacturing and IIoT division, for example, and then I try to translate that industry knowledge into actionable strategies for Grantek as well as Grantek's customers. And that generally means I'm very involved in planning discussions with customers, which gives me a lot of opportunity to see into our customers' organizations, their challenges, and how they are tackling those challenges. And then as a fun fact about myself, I once lived in Melbourne, Australia, which was pretty awesome. I was even able to scuba dive at the Great Barrier Reef, which is a memory that I'll never forget, but that sort of feels like a lifetime ago. Now I live outside of Philadelphia, and that sounds slightly less exotic. And then I'm also excited to be here with Daniel Lance, who is the more dashing-looking fellow at the bottom. Daniel complements my knowledge, where I'm a little more focused on strategies for building infrastructure. Daniel has a lot of expertise with vulnerabilities, cybersecurity threats in the OT environment. Hopefully I did that justice, but Daniel, do you want to introduce yourself as well?
Yeah, absolutely. Daniel Lance, channel partner, technical consultant, solutions engineer, and I am the guy that Jacob did not take to Australia with him, so not very happy about that. But I have a little over a decade in industrial cybersecurity experience, so really pleased to be here, and thank you, Grantek, for inviting me to share what we've uncovered here at Claroty.
Yep. Cool. And I mean, if you're going to start slinging mud, well, I could also ask where you are right now and why I'm not there with you, because it's a lot funner than it's a pretty rainy day outside here. And I would much rather be in that warm tropical looking background that you have.
Yeah, so Jacob's commenting on the fact that I live in Nicaragua. I also have a house in the States. So si yo hablas español if you ever have any engagements down south.
Does Nicaragua have daylight savings time?
No, not that I'm aware of. No, I don't think.
Proven. I have a whole country on my side. All right. So anyway, in terms of agenda, I want to start the webinar by reviewing the fundamentals, like what is digital transformation, what is industrial IT, start us all off with a common baseline understanding of some of those key topics. We're then going to talk about the state of the industry. After that, I want to kind of walk you through how I typically see organizations naturally grow their industrial IT infrastructure, and then compare that to how I think organizations should grow their industrial IT infrastructure. And then we're going to wrap up with some perspectives and strategy tips that Daniel and I would like to offer to you. So that's kind of the agenda. Something else I should mention here is that this webinar is generally geared for people interested in any of the three topics: digital transformation, or cybersecurity, or dealing with infrastructure issues such as networking issues or server issues. However, something that I want to highlight on that is that all three of those topics are very related to each other at a fundamental level. So if you're interested in just one of those topics, I would put forward that you're actually in need of sort of understanding all three of the topics. So if you are interested in just one of them, in general, you're in the right place. And then the last few comments before we go ahead and get into the meat of the webinar, take notes if you can, and I would absolutely love your feedback. So if I make a connection for you that is really insightful, or maybe if you wish I had elaborated more on something, I really like to hear those types of comments. So please do put them into the chat as I go along. That chat is private between you and I, so those types of comments are only going to come to me. On a similar note, ask questions as we go. I'm going to answer questions at the end, but I'd encourage you to type those questions in as they pop into your head rather than leaving them for the end. That is, unless it's about daylight savings time, in which case I don't want to hear any of your comments. And then finally, watch out for the light bulb icon that you see on the right. I specifically try to call out any of my main points and conclusions and takeaways with that icon. So take note of it, because it's something that I think is important for you to note. So let's start off with the first fundamental concept. What is digital transformation? So in my mind, digital transformation is basically an umbrella term. It's a little bit of a buzzword, but it describes the way that technology is replacing manual processes in many industries. And it's important to know that digital transformation is happening everywhere. So it's happening in banking, it's happening in healthcare, it's happening in education, government, e-commerce, other industries as well. But obviously what's important to us is that it's also happening in manufacturing. And in manufacturing specifically, there's also a second term that's sometimes used, which is Industry 4.0, aka the fourth industrial revolution. So to sum that up, digital transformation is an umbrella term. It applies to all industries. Industry 4.0 is a version of that that's more specific to industrial environments and manufacturing. And before I dive into detail on Industry 4.0, something that's important to understand about it is that it's happening very quickly. Not quickly in the day-to-day perspective, but quickly in comparison to similar changes like it in the past. So actually what I'm showing on the screen is the timeline for the first, second, and third industrial revolutions. And if you look at it, what you'll notice is that the time frame between industrial revolutions has been decreasing. So the first industrial revolution was in the 18th century. That was when we started using steam to power machinery. Anytime before that, we were only using mechanical tools. So the use of steam at that time was obviously a very big change. 1.5 centuries later was the second industrial revolution, which is when we started using electricity. So as you can imagine, also a huge change. Less than a century after that was when we started using computer technology in manufacturing. So this is when PLCs started to become, started being used to automate manufacturing lines. So at this point, we're now within the lifespan of some of the people on this call. And then less than half a century later, the fourth industrial revolution began, which is sort of the wave of change that we're in right now. And it's a different type of change than just computerization and automation. So digital transformation is a real thing, a little bit more than a buzzword. It's changing the entire world. It's changing manufacturing very quickly. So the next question that we could ask is, how exactly is it changing manufacturing? And another way to ask that question is, what does the smart factory of the future really look like? And in my opinion, there's many different definitions floating out there, but my view on it is that there's generally two ways to look at it. So one of those ways is more of a technology-based definition, which is where we list the different types of technologies that facilitate Industry 4.0. So those are things like augmented reality, cloud computing, cybersecurity. The other tech that I have shown on the screen are pretty much always on that list. There's a million ways to slice and dice this. Sometimes I see them listed into categories, but in general, you get the idea. Something that I do want to highlight on that is that every single Industry 4.0 technology is based on having a deep layer of connectivity. It is one of the most fundamental requirements of Industry 4.0. It's one of the facilitators of change, and that's really important to us, especially as we're looking at industrial IT as a topic, and we're going to talk a lot more about that pretty soon. The second way I see Industry 4.0 described is to talk about the effects and benefits that it has on the business. Like before, there's also a million ways to slice and dice this, but common themes that I see are that it allows vertical integration of the manufacturing process, so things like connecting PLC data to ERP systems. It also allows for horizontal integration across the supply chain. Once those pieces are integrated, you can start to automate the business processes behind them. And then finally, you can start to optimize those processes or even automate the optimization so that the business is reacting to changing conditions in real time. So I would sum up that vision by saying, essentially, imagine a world where the entire supply chain and manufacturing were automatically running and adjusting themselves in real time. So humans would sort of be monitoring and tuning the business rather than manually running it. And that's where experts see the world building towards. And by the way, if you're interested in reading more about that, there is a good blog post that I would recommend. It's in the URL at the bottom, posted on ISA's blog. And I can actually send that to you in an email after this. Okay, and that actually brings me to my first insight for you, which is marked with a little light bulb icon there. Basically, the lesson and the connection here is that when there are big changes happening like this of any kind, and Industry 4.0 definitely qualifies. It presents an opportunity for businesses to get ahead of their competition in that change. So imagine 5 years from now, which is a relatively short amount of time, if you're thinking from a strategic perspective, if you were fully ready to adopt and experiment with these new technologies as they're being introduced to the marketplace while your competition hadn't even started preparing their connectivity for it, that would be a huge advantage. So maybe you've heard of the phrase, you want to skate where the puck is going, not where it is now. This is a great time to sort of apply that type of thinking. And right now the puck is going towards Industry 4.0, so anything that you can be doing to skate in that direction is going to be a very wise strategic choice. So consider investments in your connectivity as a very smart long-term play. It's going to give you dividends in and of itself, but it's also going to give you a huge competitive advantage in the future, and that advantage can't be understated. Okay, so the next fundamental I want to put some definition around is the term industrial IT. So in general, you want to think about your industrial IT infrastructure as a foundational layer that your OT environment is using to run on top of. And I like to break that layer into 3 components, which is networking, computing, and cybersecurity. I think the networking component is relatively self-explanatory. That's your active hardware like switches and wireless access points, but it's also the physical infrastructure, cabling, and even software management tools that you're using to manage the network. The computing components include anything that's running an operating system, things like endpoints and servers and infrastructure that you may have in the cloud. And it also includes things like remote access software and thin clients. And then finally, the cybersecurity portion would include the tools, the governance framework, and the processes that you're using to manage security risks, which include activities like patching and system backups. Now, the important part of this is to try to stop thinking about the components individually, because when you're thinking about problems and you're looking at the components individually, it sort of gives you a little bit of tunnel vision. So at the end of the day, your network doesn't do anything for you if you don't have devices and applications that it's running on top of. Your computing devices are useless if they don't have a network for them to run on. And then all of the infrastructure is going to cause you more problems than you'd like it to if you don't think about security and hygiene, which is what a lot of organizations are starting to run into today. So my challenge for you on this would be always think about infrastructure holistically as a complete industrial IT infrastructure layer, instead of looking at it in parts and solving problems in parts. In general, you can't change one without affecting the other 2 areas. It's sort of like a balancing act, and you can't balance it correctly if you aren't watching all 3 of those components together. All right, so now that we've gotten some fundamental definitions and context under our belt, let's dive into how industrial IT is changing because of digital transformation. And to break that down, let's take a manufacturing facility and look at all the industrial systems it might have running inside of it. Right now, I'm showing a biopharma facility. Your facility might look a little bit different, but at the end of the day, we all have a collection of systems for processing and manufacturing goods. We all have a collection of systems for packaging and warehouse, and then we all have a collection of systems for building management. 20 years ago, for example, these would all be standalone systems, sort of like how it's shown on the screen now. So instead of each automation system where they might have a couple of network switches, maybe a PC or an HMI within them, they'd all be separate islands of automation without connectivity between them. But if we fast forward to today, at a superficial level, they may still look like islands of automation. But if we peel that layer back, the control systems are starting to run on top of a single connected infrastructure layer. So they're no longer running within their own little contained units. They've become automated units which are sitting on top of a plant-wide infrastructure. So if I could make that graphic on the screen 3-dimensional, you sort of see all your blue squares hovering on top of a connected infrastructure IT layer beneath it, which is a big change from Industry 3.0 to Industry 4.0. So something that's really interesting to me is if you ask two different types of people how they view things, you might get different answers from them. And maybe to draw a little bit of an analogy, I don't know if you ever saw the Facebook thing where some people saw a dress as gold and some people saw a dress as blue. Maybe some of you listening know what I'm talking about. The others think I'm a crazy person. But anyway, that was a big scandal at the time. This is sort of like that. If you ask somebody on the shop floor in maintenance or a production manager, they see the plant like how it looks on the left. So they'll see systems as separate systems. But if you talk to an IT person, or if you talk to somebody pushing a digital transformation initiative, they'll see the plant as one big connected system. And in my mind, that's an interesting perspective and a different way to look at the digital transformation awareness gap. And considering that causes a lot of friction between groups and friction between initiatives, that difference does matter quite a bit. So I could sort of reframe the topic of this entire webinar and say, what we're really exploring today is how do we promote the transition from the left to the right within our organization? So how do we get people to see the value? How do we build the awareness and interest? How do we structure projects? And that's a very difficult question, especially in large organizations that may have many different facilities, maybe many different facilities across many different countries. And all we're talking about right now is the infrastructure layer, let alone the actual smart manufacturing applications like analytics that sit on top of it. So this is a toughie. One important perspective to keep in mind is that the value to the business is completely different when you are comparing infrastructure on the left to infrastructure on the right. So the two forms of infrastructure are solving different problems. There are times when I speak to customers that are exploring a network deployment and they express that they don't really understand why using managed switches or managing traffic is necessary, or why virtualizing their servers or managing them that way is important to do. And the response I usually give is that if you view your plant like the image on the left and all you care about is whether the line is running or whether the line is not running, a robust infrastructure isn't important to you at all. A mature industrial IT infrastructure layer isn't going to make your lines run any faster. That's not the point of doing these things. The point is to get the plant ready for digital transformation and the business value that digital transformation brings. So if you remember earlier, I broke out the business value of digital transformation as integration across the supply chain and self-optimizing processes. That's the point of a mature industrial IT infrastructure layer. So translating this information into something actionable, I would recommend start finding ways to help people connect the dots and understand why a connected infrastructure is important to the business. The sooner people have that understanding, the sooner that you can actually get to work on solving that problem. So awareness and understanding is a very big, important and necessary step. And as an idea, I have seen organizations sort of give it a cute name. Sometimes that helps. I've heard it called the Connected Shop Floor Initiative, or the Smart Factory Initiative, or the Connected Enterprise Initiative. Something like that can help to build understanding, and it actually can work pretty well. The next thing we can do is look at some data to benchmark how far along is the world in digital transformation, and ask, are we ahead of everybody else, or are we actually behind? So one way to do this is to look at the maturity index that was published by Acatech. And if you're not familiar with Acatech, they're a working academy. They're based in Germany. They hold some authority over the subject, and they broke out Industry 4.0 maturity based on value to the business, essentially. So the first stage is computerization, which most organizations have done and is the basis for digital transformation. The second stage is connectivity. And then all the way at the end is adaptability, which is where essentially the business can autonomously self-optimize based on real-time data it's collecting across the entire business. So if you haven't noticed, Architect's definition of Industry 4.0 maturity is pretty similar to the business value-based definition of digital transformation that I showed early on. So what's interesting for us is that they also researched and published their findings on where manufacturers scored against their own index. And that research found that 80% of organizations scored in the connectivity stage of their maturity index. You can download all of these reports directly off their website for free, by the way. There's a lot of added context into that. I do recommend you read it. The URL is at the bottom. You can also pretty easily Google it. But the lesson here, I think, is to notice how directly industrial IT and connectivity is tied to digital transformation. So connectivity is not just a supporting component to enable you to do digital transformation. You literally cannot achieve digital transformation without first developing your connectivity. And that's a very important, I think, an impactful way to look at it. The other thing to notice is that most organizations aren't truly ready to implement things like augmented reality or artificial intelligence, at least in a broad sense. So in general, there are more fundamental challenges that are preventing them from doing those things. And in many cases, investing and focusing on your infrastructure and connectivity is the most innovative thing that your organization can be doing, which is, I don't think, is how most organizations are looking at their network and infrastructure today. And then my last highlight here, for those of you that like to look even further ahead, which is a wise thing to do, once you do get into the visibility stage, your key challenge is going to be centralizing data and having a single source of truth that everybody bases their decisions on. That's more of a computing problem. So maybe your networking and your connectivity is the primary issue now, but computing is going to be your primary issue tomorrow. So something to keep in mind is to try to, I guess, keep that future challenge in mind and bake that into your approach with connectivity. Maybe that's going to save you some frustration and challenges down the road. Okay, so something else I'd like to talk about is let's take a look at how manufacturers grow their infrastructure naturally. So if I don't pay any attention to their infrastructure, if there's no plan or strategy, how do things typically turn out? And then let's compare that to if there's any lessons learned or anything that can be optimized in that path. And I'm going to start by kind of walking you through the stages that I usually see organizations go through. So the most limited form of infrastructure is islands of automation, which is where many manufacturers started their journey. We still see this in some older facilities or maybe some facilities that haven't gotten a lot of love. But in general, that form of infrastructure is dying a slow death. The next stage up is infrastructure layer that's been connected organically, maybe in an unplanned way. So out of all of the types of infrastructure that I see, this is the one that I see the most. And something that's really important to pay attention to on that is that this is where your Ics security risks are at their absolute highest. So you have, at this stage, you have connections going throughout most of your OT environment without considering control or security. And that's the type of network where it's the easiest for malware to enter. It's the easiest for malware to move around in once it has entered. And essentially, the impact of an incident is going to be at its greatest. So kind of what I'm saying here is the most common type of infrastructure layer I see today is also the most risky. So if you're listening and you're kind of wondering how to create change within your industrial IT strategy, if the benefits of digital transformation aren't enough, maybe if you add in security risks and the risk burden that your infrastructure is carrying into that equation, maybe it will be. So from there, the next step up is an architected industrial IT environment where maybe you have a DMZ, some managed switches, firewalls, and things like that. And then finally, the last stage is where not only do you have an architected infrastructure layer, but There's also a governance framework in place to continuously monitor and improve security, and you can very easily innovate and adapt technologies like cloud without having infrastructure burdens to try to tackle. So a takeaway from the slide is that the individual steps and the natural progression, or at least the way I look at it, is interesting, but more important than that is knowing that progressing through each of these stages one by one is a painful way to do it, because you're sort of meandering from side to side throughout the road instead of marching directly down the road towards your goal, which is a smart enabled factory. So not only is it slow, it's also costly. You're going to be spending money repetitively, and all of that is unnecessary. If you only ever deploy infrastructure to support specific systems that you're putting in one at a time, this is the path that you're going to take. But if you set a plant-wide strategy, you connect the business benefits of a connected infrastructure layer together, you're going to take a more direct path towards that step 4 and ultimately gain that competitive advantage that I talked about earlier. And we're going to talk about more of those things pretty soon, but before I do, now that we've started to hit on how high security risks are in the ICS environment, we do have Daniel here who can shed some light on exactly how vulnerable are OT networks today. So I guess with that, Daniel, could I hand off to you?
Yeah, great. Thank you, Jacob. No, that was really great. So Grantek has asked me to come in and cover the existing state of vulnerabilities and what we're currently seeing in the OT landscape. In particular, this is a great opportunity to call attention to our biannual ICS Risk and Vulnerability Report that is freely available on our website, Claroty.com. Also something that the Grantek team can help you get a hold of. So a couple of things about this. We started studying maybe a year ago what signals we could attribute to risks and vulnerabilities in ICS, and more so, where can we backfill or guide our researchers? We have a really large team of researchers. Many of them have really great backgrounds. Even myself, I'm not a part of the research team. I have 40 plus NVD indicators myself. Claroty has really gone out of their way to find these people. So what conclusions can we draw is one of the first big questions that we deliver in the report. Additionally, what story do these vulnerabilities tell us about security practitioners today? And how do we guide our research against the InfoSec community? We hear about these really large attacks in the news, but how do those line up against the path forward? So Jacob, if you'll move forward for us. I want to make a forward-looking statement here about some caveats in the reports and the data we're going to go over. We're just scoping in on a small set of this data for your pleasure today. And some of the vulnerabilities that have been disclosed in 2020, of course, are not out there yet. These things take a really long time. Certainly some of mine took in excess of 6 months to get fully disclosed. So it's not all inclusive. This is not APT monitoring. So we're not going through and tracking groups or anything as part of this report. It's not that kind of data. Just another caveat, without data, you're just another person with an opinion. So we're looking at the facts of the environment and the world around us here. We'll go ahead and move forward here. So about the data set, we're really focusing in on ICS cert. That's a dedicated industrial cert for cybersecurity. We're focusing on CVEs. We're focusing on NVD data in particular. Go ahead and move forward there. So shotgun approach, by the numbers, what we saw in the second half, 2020, 449 ICS related vulnerabilities disclosed. Again, 59 of those affecting ICS vendors, 41 of which were actually delivered by Claroty. So a great contribution that our team has made. Let's go ahead and move forward here. And when we look at vulnerabilities, we really want to speak to the origin of the vulnerabilities. It's largely coming from external resources, meaning it's not the ICS vendor that's doing the research, finding the vulnerabilities. They are doing some amount of that internally, but by and large, it's external resources. So let's go ahead and move forward. So some key trends that we're going to look at from a high level. Again, we're just kind of scoping the data here. Let's go forward one more. We're going to look into the year-over-year comparison, and what we notice here from 2018 to 2020, looking at the total averages of each of those years, we see an almost 25% growth in research. So that's not only are we seeing more and more attacks in the industrial space, but we're seeing more research, we're seeing more vendors become aware and become more active. So those are all really good things. Let's go ahead and move forward. So what we also saw in addition was 14 new companies being added last year, or sorry, the year before that, in 2019, there was over 21 new vendors that were added. These are mostly small vendors, and that's what's accessible for researchers to get their hands on, are some of these smaller vendors. And so it may not always be the most critical devices, but it still may represent a path into your network. So small vendors have more accessibility, they're more accessible, there's going to be a lot more reports going forward, I think, for small vendors. So let's go ahead and move forward. So the research groups, really important to break down how we're categorizing these. Of course, third-party companies, as we mentioned earlier, represent the bulk of researchers and reports that are getting delivered. Independent researcher, I was myself an independent researcher when I filled most of mine. The vendors are picking up; they're picking up in disclosure. So that's all really good things. Anonymous researchers, sometimes that's maybe somebody that even works with a company, but they're not really allowed to publicly disclose. Occasionally you get some of those reports. But we're seeing overall collectively the industry moving towards more and more coordinated disclosure, which means a lot more things to patch, frankly. So let's go ahead and move forward. And I want to focus in on this for a minute, because it definitely tells a story. The air gap is essentially dead, right? Moving forward into COVID, we've realized more and more we need to be able to access these networks, these industrial networks. They're, as part of Industry 4.0 and the evolution that we're seeing, and it really is an evolution of existing technology, not a revolution. But the evolution that we've seen is towards more connectivity. And we're seeing a large number of attack vectors still being executed at the network level, but we're not really seeing so much getting done physical attack layer or adjacent device. Those adjacent devices oftentimes are hops from one box to another. A lot of times those attack vectors are really, really difficult to discover in your network, because they impact both network operational capability of the device and cybersecurity related concerns. So to really zero down and in on which devices need the most focus in your network, looking at the attack vectors into your network can really be vital in determining what the issue could be with the hearts and lungs of your facility. Certainly with BMS and other systems, we think about even data centers today, or even food processing centers. It's very straightforward when you think of shop floor, but a lot of times you don't consider even opening an application on your phone has compound industrial cybersecurity vulnerabilities that could impact the availability of something like an application. So it's in all parts of our environment today. It's not going to change. And a lot of us have to mature and get a lot better visibility and understanding of where these threats are coming from. So with attack vectors mostly being from network, we're also seeing that majority of those don't require a click, meaning they don't require you to touch a button to do anything. Most of these attacks can be successfully executed remotely without an end user clicking on anything. So definitely an overall ratcheting up of the concerns around these devices. In IT, we were able to build with our adversaries in a very equal and balanced way, We weren't allowed to do that with OT. One great example that I like to use for this with IT is the moment that we determined that platform viruses were a problem, people were able to install things like antivirus. They were able to equally counter the attacker and meet them halfway, and many times actually outdesign and outbuild the structure that an attacker would be able to utilize against them. We're not able to do that in such a straightforward way today without a great deal of considerations as to how we keep operations alive and functioning. And that's certainly where a partner like Grantek comes in to help move you through that journey. But I think I'll have some more on this a little bit later. Jacob, I'm going to turn it back over to you. I think that's the last slide I had here. Right. Oh yeah, user interaction. I apologize. So yeah, user interaction. That's the no-click element. So 78% of these attacks of that 400 plus number did not require the user to even be aware the attack was taking place. It could successfully execute without any interaction on the platform. So pretty startling. 21% needing some interaction. That could be something as simple as you logging into a workstation and then being able to capture the credentials. So interaction a lot of times can be vague when it comes to some of these alerts, and a lot of times user interaction can be personified by just operational capability. Going into work, doing your job may constitute a user interaction as far as a lot of these certs are concerned. So at a high level, again, we have a lot more information on this. We have a lot more detailed analysis of these signals in that report. We're happy to talk about it with you.
Awesome. All right, let's see. Okay, gotcha. So yeah, thanks, Daniel, for the summary. I don't think I ever heard the phrase before, if you don't have the data to back it up, you're just another person with an opinion, which is, I hadn't heard that before, and I like it. I'm probably going to steal it a little bit. Anyway, so as a quick refresher at this point, we've talked about what digital transformation is and why pursuing it is important for the business. We've also talked about what industrial IT is and connectivity and how it's directly tied to digital transformation. So what I want to spend the rest of our time talking about is what are some actionable things that we can do to promote industrial IT growth and security within an organization. So obviously these aren't holistic solutions. We couldn't give that to you in one webinar, but I think they are important items that often get overlooked. And sort of a mantra that I like to fall back on when discussing large, potentially complicated plans like this is that any roadmap in the world starts with three things, which is where are you at now, where do you want to be, and then how are you going to get there. So for argument's sake, let's say you already have a good understanding of where you're at now with each of your facilities. Maybe you've done assessments, so step one is done. The next step is defining where you want to be and then communicating that to the organization at large. And a great way to do that, which often gets overlooked, are corporate standards and reference architectures. So ideally, you map your business requirements over to a high-level technical architecture once, you produce those artifacts, and then to oversimplify it, you say, hey, this is the overall plan that we have to get to. You guys are responsible for making it happen within your existing processes. And the documents don't go into detail, so there's wiggle room for details to vary based on maybe individual team and facility preferences, but the core consistency is there and laid out. I would say the big common challenge that I see with that approach is that teams can't always justify the added cost of infrastructure inside the automation project because it puts the ROI calculation upside down. Or maybe the team running the project doesn't really see the value in the additional infrastructure components and design, so they just don't do it. And that's actually a very big problem because there are a ton of opportunities to fix infrastructure while doing automation projects. So things that you're going to do anyway are opportunities to fix this other problem, but we miss those opportunities all the time. And it's actually even potentially worse than that, because maybe you're not only missing the opportunity, but you're also deploying new poor architecture, and you're digging yourself deeper into this hole by adding that in. So I guess maybe to summarize, the lesson on both of the first two bullet points would be that if you can't re-architect your infrastructure all in one shot, which is often the case, at least prevent adding additional poor infrastructure. And you can do that by providing standards and giving teams the tools that they need to justify the cost of proper architecture. And then the last thing that I'll mention here is that is the importance of an IT/OT task force monitoring overall progress, being made aware of issues that are happening on the plant floor, which can be challenging to monitor and be aware of, but being aware of those things is incredibly important. In general, industrial IT tends to be the space that has the most overlap technically between the two groups, so getting some like-minded individuals to be working together and driving it is a huge help. And then another really important piece to think about is how to factor in security, how to factor in risk management into your industrial IT plan. So if we look at the full cybersecurity risk management cycle, it can be portrayed in a few different ways, but it always includes these core components, which is framing your business case and quantifying your tolerable risk through a governance framework, assessing the actual risk, and then implementing controls to close the gap. And then, of course, continuously monitoring and improving the cycle. It is going to be a recurring live process, not a one and done type thing. And I guess how to connect this cycle to digital transformation is that you can use this to help justify the digital transformation initiative, or at least to align the two processes. So, for example, you can do a posture assessment or a risk assessment, which in and of itself is going to give you a lot of useful information. It's going to give you great pointers for how to mitigate your the business risk. But it's also going to give you ammunition that you can use to develop a business case for infrastructure investments to progress your digital transformation journey. So you can look at, you can look at it and say, hey, we need to start thinking about digital transformation and connectivity for strategic purposes. There's these new technologies coming down the pipeline that we need to be looking at and we're not prepared for. But on top of that, we're also carrying this existing risk burden, which we can alleviate at the same time. So if we do it right, not only can we get a jumpstart in digital transformation, we can increase our competitive advantage. That's a very powerful thing to do. I think that gets forgotten all the time. So to kind of put it simply, use your cybersecurity and posture assessments as justification for digital transformation, in addition to identifying your cybersecurity priorities. So kind of the lesson underscoring that's all the lesson that is underscoring all of this is that when you're looking at your industrial IT challenges, justify investments against the benefits of digital transformation strategy as well as security risk reduction to the business. And if you do that properly, you can actually design for security from the ground up rather than going back and trying to add security in later. So from a certain perspective, being a little bit behind in this journey is actually an opportunity for you. It gives you some advantages because you're in a position where you can kind of look at your environment at each facility and say, for example, hey, these are the areas that are the least critical to our business. They carry the least risk. We're going to intentionally assign them a low security requirement. And then these areas are of medium importance and carry some risk. Let's assign a medium security requirement there. And then these systems are the most important. They carry the highest risk. If a security incident affected them, we'd be in big, big trouble. Let's assign the highest security requirements to those. And then you basically use those security profiles not just to apply compensating controls, but you use those profiles to design your infrastructure from the ground up. And that is a very powerful thing. Designing based on security is a lot better than applying security to an existing design, which is the overall lesson here. The other thing that you need to consider is that you can use a lot of existing tools to gain visibility into your OT environment and start planning this process with an asset inventory, understanding of existing threats. And this is generally one of the first steps in overall cybersecurity management. And to talk a little bit more about that, I'm going to hand it back over to Daniel to walk us through that.
So you're probably wondering by now, what exactly is Claroty, and how do we tackle these issues, and how do we do it in an intelligible way? Definitely, you have to start with a plan. You have to start implementing some of the things that Jacob is talking about. You do have an advantage. Although you can't necessarily build your defenses in the same way that you did, or you might have with IT, you do have options to consider as to how you visualize and protect these environments. Let's go ahead and move forward here. So what we've learned about the industrial networks is the first thing you want to do, of course, is be able to identify what's in the environment. You want asset enumeration. You want to be able to figure out what's there, and then we do that with revealing all of the assets. So we're able to do that under the Claroty platform. We protect all of the assets. That's understanding the CVEs, the NVD data against those assets, even having some custom databases built into the platform that are supplied through our relationships with some of the ICS vendors. And then you want to be able to detect any attempts to access those assets, malicious or otherwise, baseline changes, somebody coming in at Friday at 5 o'clock and deciding they're going to do program uploads and downloads. Those are all things we want to be able to detect in our environment as they're happening. And that plays into not only resiliency of the system, uptime, and cybersecurity nature of the environment, but detecting can be so much more. It can be a broader way of looking at the network with factual intelligence that's actionable. And we supply all that in the Claroty platform. And then lastly, Connect. Connect is the ability to, now you have all this data, what are we going to do with it? How are we going to consume it? How do we make it actionable? And we do that through a whole range of not only IT-centric integrations, OT-centric integrations, unique tools and apps that we interface with. So at its core, we are asset visibility, we're vulnerability management and threat detection, risk management. We have another product called Secure Remote Access I'd like to go through with you at a future time. And at the bottom of the slide, what I want to call attention to is the OT bracket there, the operational technology. A lot of that probably looks like what you have on your shop floor today. And progressively, you're starting to see more of the industrial Internet of Things, more of the smart building BMS that we were talking about earlier, video systems, intelligent lighting systems. All of those are becoming a regular part of how our businesses function, and they're really becoming the hearts and lungs of the business. Door access systems, certainly. And moving forward in Industry 4.0, where the shop floor is changing and evolving rapidly, we're seeing a huge influx of cloud services coming into OT, and we have to know how to structure and design those properly. And a lot of that just starts with being able to visualize what we have and how we're going to adapt a risk-based approach to the network that we're observing. Let's go ahead and move forward here. So this slide really personifies just why Claroty has become the solution for anomaly detection. We started out with just core anomaly detection. We realized that we could do so much more with the platform. We could build so much more depth into the platform, and we've led this with integrations with Palo Alto, Checkpoint, Fortinet, multiple of your leading IT solutions. We already have canned integrations to being able to set policy or zone-based policy inside of CTD. That's our product, continuous threat detection. Being able to set those policies so that they go up to the firewall, automatically quarantine a device, and then throw that over to something like ServiceNow or a ticketing system to be able to issue a request for baselining to have someone go out and maintenance that device. And additionally, other leading tools like CrowdStrike have chosen to also partner with us from a technological perspective to, again, make it easier to consume the data that we're providing and make it more and more actionable. So let's go ahead and move forward, Jacob. So how do we do this? We have a deep protocol library. We have a DPI engine that it's absolutely world-class that actually tears apart all the packets. A lot of these protocols that are running on your network are unsecure, and not a lot of people really know a whole lot about them. And so we've actually had to go out to the manufacturers and have them factory accepted, tested. Again, we've already covered some of our research team. We have a world-class research team, and we have a broad portfolio of capabilities, meaning we can go into multiple different industries and networks and be fully suited on those networks. Let's go ahead and move forward. So again, kind of speaking to the evolution of these attacks, as we've seen, you know, back in 2010, we only had Stuxnet, we had Aurora. Those were the big ones that kind of made the news. We had some idea that other things might have been happening in the environment. There was even at one point for energy, they started tracking squirrels. There's a website called Cyber Squirrel that you can look up. And the joke was that there was always a squirrel anytime there was an outage that nobody could explain. And we've seen kind of a progression and more sophisticated attacks, nation state style attacks. But we also see low-level attackers getting involved and getting in the action. The main takeaway that I want to leave with you about the OT threat landscape is we're more and more approaching a time and space where to commit a crime, to commit a financial crime or otherwise, you don't need to risk physical violence to do so. So this isn't going to go away tomorrow. Vendors and consultants alike are all doing everything they can to try to mature these processes, but we're fighting a completely new landscape, and it's not going to go anywhere. If you had the option to rob a bank and you didn't have to risk getting off the couch, would you do it? For some people, that's a yes. For me, that's a no. But I want to skip over to the actual platform and show you just a glimpse of the software here while we have some time, and then I'm going to toss it back over to Jacob. So let me do that.
Okay, that sounds good.
All right, so you should see the main dashboard here. And this is actually CTD, continuous threat detection. This is the main dashboard that you'll see whenever you log in. And again, it follows those pillars of visibility, discovered assets. Here we have a breakdown, automatic categorization. When you plug into the network, we're able to do this passively, and we'll break out all of your OT assets, your IT assets, your IoT assets. We'll give you network level analytics on the devices as well, and which protocols are most prominent in your network. And this really is serving three different factors: operational, network, and cybersecurity. Moving more into cybersecurity related, we have risks and vulnerabilities, our hygiene score. This hygiene score is a retrospective over time. And so as new CVEs come out, as you get those emails from vendors saying you need to patch immediately, here's you know, this and this issue, you don't have to go out to the shop floor and crawl around on the floor and build a list to figure out which one of those CVEs might exist in your environment. The hygiene score will show the retrospective over time. You can dig into those insights, figure out exactly where the vulnerabilities are in your network. Here in the top insights, this is a dynamic list that changes on every single network. We do this per asset, we do this per network, we do it per enterprise, and it shows you your top risky assets and the things that you need to focus on, only what matters first. And that's curated by our team of experts. So it gets you actionable data faster. Our alert status, this is breaking down all the signals and behavior that we see on the network. And we're able to actually tell a story with the data. And we're able to drill down and into exactly what happened, who all was implicated. And we also create a significant amount of data for your incident responders to go out and have something actionable. One thing I want to point to lastly here is our risk-based approach to the environment. Here we have zoning. And in our zones, we're actually breaking out certain assets. Jacob covered this really well, where sometimes you want to focus on a subset of assets that you want to have some protection against. or you want to be able to protect from others. This allows you to do that, and it allows you to do this by looking at what actionable threats do we have against those assets, and then how do we solve for those risks. Here in my attack vector, if you remember, we were talking about attack vectors earlier. I'm actually automatically building out all the attack vectors into your environment. You might get a question from your C class someday soon. How is someone going to get into the network? And just how are they going to do it? We have firewalls. We have this kind of stuff. Well, this is exactly how they're going to do it. They're going to execute this vulnerability. They're going to execute this vulnerability, and they're going to utilize your remote networking here in order to get access to the first one. We're living in a day and age where you can download a piece of software off the internet. If you know the right combination of buttons to press, you've essentially cracked the safe, right? So it's a totally new threat landscape. It's something that is evolving every single day in complexity and uniqueness that we've never really seen before, and we don't have the same adequate defenses that we once had on desktop computing. So we have to have solutions like this, and we have to have unique approaches to the problem. And that's something that I think Grantek does very well. I think we do exceptionally well, of course, with CTD and being able to provide Grantek that visibility. But I want to turn it back over to Jacob for any closing thoughts here.
Just to pull up this real quick. So that does bring us to the end of the webinar. I hope you got something out of this, maybe a couple nuggets of information or some different perspectives that you can look at these types of problems with that you hadn't considered before. In my eyes, if you got one useful insight out of it, it was worth the time, and I'm glad I could give that to you. As some quick shout outs, Daniel and I are both very active on LinkedIn. You can follow us for some additional information. There is a Industrial IT for Digital Transformation guide on Grantek's website that you can download. Daniel also went through Claroty's biannual report, which gives even more context into the type of information that he went over. And as a last reminder, if you have any feedback on the webinar that you'd like to share with us, I would love to hear that feedback. So please do put it into the chat. Again, that only comes to me. Other than that, we can take a couple minutes to answer questions. I know we're a little bit tight on time at this point, so I'm probably going to move through those quickly. And I do know, I do see a couple that had come in. I'm going to try to group them based on similarity. So I see one question. I actually see multiple questions that are sort of focused on IoT connectivity and how are there solutions available? What is the approach? My input on that would be that in some ways it doesn't change that much. The same standards still apply. I can offer to you that the 62443 series, there are work groups looking into how IoT systems can apply into the standard, and the takeaway or the highlight from that is that the cloud service provider is the big new factor that shares some responsibility in the security. However, the controls and the approach in general and the standards and its application don't change that much. It's just a matter of which party is going to be responsible for which components, and that kind of changes a little bit. I also wouldn't say that there is a solution. Go buy this technology and now your IoT is secured. It doesn't quite work that way. And I'll take one more question and then we're going to call it at time. Let me see. So I see one that I want to address this one. It's, can we show value from just connectivity? And this is actually hitting on a very key point that I tried to articulate throughout the webinar, is that connectivity is an enabler for digital transformation. So connectivity is an enabler of these things that bring value to the business. Connectivity in and of itself is notoriously difficult to justify value and ROI against. Putting in a switch, everything's going to run the same. Things aren't going to run more quickly. So there is a very big strategic component to connectivity. that has to be realized and factored into that equation. With that, I'm going to let you go. Thank you all for attending the webinar. Please do email info@grantek.com if you're looking to connect with me directly, if you'd like to start a conversation, if you just want more information related to the things that we went over. Thank you, everybody, for your time, and have a good rest of your day. Thanks so much.